everybody, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. Today we're going to be covering another grammar pattern, and today's lesson is going to kind of involve two grammar patterns, but they both revolve around the same word that basically constructs them. And that word is going to be kaneru, and what we're going to do is basically we're going to take a look at the grammar pattern that is formed by using the positive version of the word kaneru. Then we're also going to take a look at the grammar pattern that is formed from the negative version of the verb kaneru, which is going to be kane nai basically. And so surprisingly enough, these two grammar patterns aren't going to mean the opposite of each other, even though kane nai and kaneru are the opposites of each other in a sense in terms of positive and negative conjugation. We've seen this dynamic before, and it is somewhat common in the Japanese language where we do a grammar pattern that kind of revolves around a word, like the word in this case kaneru, and then even though we conjugate it into the negative, that doesn't quite exactly mean the negative version of the grammar pattern as well. So just to lay things out straight right now, our two grammar patterns are going to be using the pre-mas form of a verb plus the positive form of the word kaneru, which is just going to be that in and of itself, kaneru. And this is going to translate to something along the lines of to not be able to do. Then after that, we're going to look at the negative version, and this is going to mean something else entirely. It'll still have the same construction pretty much, the pre-mas form of a verb plus kane nai instead of kaneru, because nai is the negative form, and that isn't going to mean the opposite of to not be able to do, which would be to be able to do. It instead is going to mean it is likely that that verb is going to happen. So these are two different grammar patterns pretty much, and they don't really have their definitions in common. And so yeah, the point that I kind of just wanted to make at the beginning here is that even though we're using kaneru and kane nai, which are positives and negatives, they have different meanings entirely that aren't the opposite of each other, and I may have come on too strong and just made everything more confusing, but let's just jump into things. So these two grammar patterns are actually going to be not too common. They're actually pretty formal grammar patterns, and you'll probably see them more in writing than in spoken Japanese language. In the case of kaneru, the positive form, it's pretty rare to hear this at all unless you're in a really formal setting, such as a business workplace where someone's talking to their superiors or something. But when we move on to the negative form, kane nai, this is also pretty formal, and you'll probably see it more in writing than in spoken language, but it's more likely that you'll hear this in everyday conversation than you would the positive form, kaneru. So because this grammar pattern that is constructed with the positive form of the word kaneru is so rare, we're just going to do one quick example of that, and this is just going to be the simple line, sumimasen, wakari kanemasu. And so what this line right here is just going to translate to is quite simply, I apologize, I don't understand. So if we go into this sentence now and we kind of break it down, we see that it pretty much is just a two-word sentence. So this is pretty simple here. First up, we have this kind of just default term, sumimasen, which is a common Japanese expression that just means excuse me, or I apologize, or I'm sorry. Then we have our grammar pattern at work here, which is just kind of this compound word of the word wakaru, which means to be able to understand, and that is going to be the verb that we use with this grammar pattern of kaneru, which means that we're going to have to conjugate it into its mas form, which is wakarimasu. Then we're going to have to take the pre-mas form of that, which is just basically the stem of that, so we drop the mas and then we have wakari, and now we're going to add our word that makes this grammar pattern here, kaneru. And so wakari kaneru, we're going to conjugate that into the mas form as well, because this is going to be a polite sentence, a pretty formal sentence. So that in turn right there turns into wakari kanemasu. And so as I said earlier, the definition or the function of this grammar pattern here, the pre-mas form of a verb plus kaneru or kanemasu, is going to basically translate to not be able to do something. And to say to be able to do something or to not be able to do something is of course very basic language here. We've covered this in previous videos in probably more than one form. We did the koto ga dekiru to mean to be able to do, so the negative form of that, koto ga dekinai, is basically a synonym to this kind of. Then we also did, of course, the more natural potential form where you have the rareru or reru, and so that negative form of that would just be a synonym with this as well, so to not be able to do. But of course, like I said, since this grammar pattern here is so rare and you only really use it in formal expression or in writing, those two synonyms right there, koto ga dekinai or the negative potential form rarenai, those two are going to be, of course, much more common. But as always, of course, it's good to know what something means, because in the seldom case that you do hear it, you should obviously just know what it means. And so one last note before we move on to the next example sentence. If you're wondering why we translated this example sentence into English as I don't understand as opposed to I cannot understand, because we said that this grammar pattern's function is kind of negative potential, not just negative. The reason behind that is because we just happen to use a special kind of verb in this case, which is the verb wakaru, which means to be able to understand or to understand. It kind of has an innate quality of potential form in it already. So yeah, if you didn't know that, worth checking out so you don't confuse more things in the future when you see example sentences using the verb wakaru, which means to be able to understand. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to the negative version. I might be confusing you still by saying this is the negative version. This is basically just an entirely different grammar pattern since it means something completely else. But yeah, now we are going to cover the grammar pattern that is the pre-mas form of a verb with the word added onto it, ka ne nai, which is the negative form of kaneru. So what this grammar pattern here is going to translate to or mean, generally speaking, is something will likely happen, and that something is going to be that verb that we are using with the grammar pattern, which is conjugated into its pre-mas form. So the things that we need to know before we go into the example sentence for this is, of course, like I said, this is pretty formal, but you might hear it in everyday conversation every so often. The second important thing is that this is going to be used to say something is likely to happen, and that something is going to be an adverse thing, as in you don't want it to happen. And so kind of stemming off naturally from that condition is going to be that when you use this grammar pattern, pretty much that action isn't going to be something that you, the speaker, performs. Because, you know, since it's something that you don't want to happen, and it's negative, it would sound kind of unnatural if you say it's likely to happen that I'll do something that I don't want to happen. And yeah, hopefully that made sense. So now let's just jump into the first example sentence that we have for this grammar pattern. And so for our first line, we have sonna ni hayaku shitara misu o shikanenai. And so what this line is going to translate to is something along the lines of, if you work on it at such a quick pace, you're likely to end up making a mistake somewhere. So let's break down the sentence and get a feel of everything that's working out here. This is a pretty simple sentence. First up, we just have the adverb sonnani, and this is going to mean that much, and it's going to be modifying the adjective right after it, which is the adjective hayai, which means quick or fast. That is also going to be an adverb. So the sonnani is going to be modifying the adverb right after it, actually. So it's going to be that quick, but since quick is also an adverb here, it's going to be that quickly. And so since we turned hayai into an adverb, that means it's going to be modifying the action right after it. So we're doing something that quickly, and that something that we're doing is actually just going to be the verb doing. It's the default verb, basically, suru, which means to do. So if you do that quickly, and this is kind of the implication here that do is doing work or working on something. And so to do, suru is going to be conjugated here as well into its tada form, which basically means if you do. So if you do that so quickly. And now we move on to the second half of the sentence, which begins with our direct object, which is going to be misu, which is just going to be a katakana word for the English word miss, and this is basically going to be used to mean error. So you could consider misu here as an direct object, or you can kind of consider it as a suru verb as well. So we have the direct object marker o right after it, but you could also consider it as a suru verb. So misu o suru, suru is what we have after. So misu o suru is going to mean basically to do a miss, to make a miss, to make a mistake, to make an error. And so this second suru that we have in the sentence here is actually going to be the verb that we're going to use with the grammar pattern now. So what that means is we have to follow the construction of the grammar pattern, which means we need it in its pre-mas form. So suru is going to turn into shimas, which is going to be the mas form. Then we drop the mas, so it's just going to be shi. That's the pre-mas form of it. And now we can just add on the phrasing ka ne nai onto this pre-mas form of the verb, and so we have shi ka ne nai. And with that, we should know what shi ka ne nai means, because like I said, this grammar pattern means likely to happen. And what is likely to happen? The verb that we use with it. So if we consider suru not just suru, but as the verbal noun misu suru, which means to make a mistake, then this is going to translate to likely to make a mistake. Combine that with the first half of the sentence. If you work, or if you do that at such a quick pace, then you're likely to make a mistake. Sonna ni hayaku shitara misu o shikanenai. Alright, so that was a pretty simple example sentence. Let's go through one more using kanenai. And so for our next example sentence, we have the line ko suryo ga fue kanenai kara hayaku dekaketa hou ga ii. So this example sentence right here is going to translate to something along the lines of there's likely to be a lot of traffic, so it be best to leave as soon as possible. Once again, let's break down the sentence just to get a feel of how everything's working here. So our first word is going to be the noun kosuryo. This word is basically just going to translate to traffic or the amount of traffic. It is going to be the subject of our first clause here. So we're going to mark it with the particle ga because it's about to perform an action here, and that action is actually going to be the action that we're going to use in this grammar pattern. So it's going to be a verb in its pre-mas form, and as we move on, we see that is the verb fueru, which means to increase or to grow bigger. So fueru, the mas form of that is fuemas, and so we take out that mas, and then we have fue, which is going to be the pre-mas form of fueru. Now that it's in its pre-mas form, all we have to do now is plug in the phrasing kanenai to mean likely to increase. And so if we connect that with what we have so far with the traffic and marking that as the subject, then this is simply going to translate to traffic is likely to increase, which is, again, an adverse situation. We don't want that. And so that's going to complete our first clause in the sentence. We're going to end it with the conjunction kara, which means basically because. So because traffic is likely to increase. Now we move on to the second half of the sentence. We have the adverb once again, hayaku, which means quickly or fastly, whatever. That is going to be modifying the verb dekakeru, which means basically to go out, to depart, to leave. However, we're going to conjugate that into its ta form because we want to use it with the grammar pattern that is the ta form of a verb plus the phrasing hoga-i to mean basically it's best to do that verb or it's better to do that verb. And so then dekaketa hoga-i is going to translate to it's best to leave, or it's better to leave. Combine that with the whole rest of the sentence, and once again we have because traffic is likely to increase or because there's likely to be a lot of traffic. It'd be best if we left as soon as possible. Kosuryo ga fue kanenai kara hayaku dekaketa hoga ii. And okay, that example is gonna wrap up this lesson. We covered the two grammar patterns that are formed by the word that is kaneru. One when we're using the positive form of kaneru, which is basically just the positive form, and that is going to be the pre-mas form of another verb plus the word kaneru to mean to not be able to do that verb, and it's used in formal settings, usually seen in writing, pretty rare in spoken language unless you're in a really formal scenario such as a workplace where you're talking to your superiors or your bosses or something. And then the second grammar pattern that is also formed by the word kaneru, but it has to be in its negative form, which is kanenai, and it has pretty much identical construction wherein we need a verb in its pre-mas form, then we just plug in kanenai, and that is going to instead mean likely to happen, and the likely thing to happen is going to be expressed as a negative thing, an adverse thing, and it's usually not going to be something that you are going to do. The speaker is going to do. And yeah, it's also pretty formal. You'll see it in writing more so than spoken language probably, but there are cases where it appears in everyday conversation where people are just kind of trying to warn people that you shouldn't do something because something negative might happen. And so yeah, hopefully you learned something new. The example sentence that we went over not only contained examples of this grammar pattern, but it also had traces of other grammar patterns that we've covered in the past. So if you need a refresher on those, or if you didn't know what they meant, then check out our previous videos where we've covered a bunch of other grammar patterns. And thanks for watching. Leave a comment or question below if you have any, and stay tuned for the next lesson.